We have reached the final point in our program before the farewell. So we are actually waiting for a Lennart Meri lecture and our final keynote. The lecture was supposed to be given here in Tallinn by Paul Goble, Analyst, Columnist, and the former special advisor to the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State, Mr. James Baker.
And Lennart Meri.
And Lennart Meri, and he was a very good friend of Lennart Meri. Unfortunately, he had a surgery just a few days before the conference, and the surgery turned out to be a little bit more difficult than he expected this to be, so the doctors advised him not to travel. But he feels well and he looks good, and he's ready to deliver the speech via Skype. Paul, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, fine. Unfortunately, we cannot see your face on the main screen.
Okay.
Because of some sort of technical reasons which I cannot explain, but we see you on side screens. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. It's probably better you can't see my face. I feel like a chipmunk from the surgery on my jaw, but I'm really very pleased to have this opportunity. I'm very grateful to President Ilves and the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm especially pleased to have a chance to recall Lennart Meri on this occasion, as on many others. And it is particularly important to talk about the things I'd like to discuss today, which is, as all of you know, the 29th anniversary of the Chernobyl accident, which, among other things, severed whatever remaining ties of trust between the peoples of the Soviet Union and even the most progressive person who might appear in the Kremlin. What I would like to talk about today is the challenge that we need to think about of how we're going to move forward after Vladimir Putin loses in Ukraine, because I believe that will happen. It will not necessarily be soon or easy, but it will be. It is going to happen. And just as there were discussions during World War I and World War II after about how the world would be organized in the future, I think those of us who knew Lennart Meri well would recognize immediately that he would be saying that it is a mistake only to look at the next step. It is necessary to look 5 or 6 steps on, and that's what I would like to try to do today. Since Vladimir Putin's Anschluss of Crimea and his subversion elsewhere in Ukraine, Western leaders have consistently talked about the need to restore the status quo ante, to go back to a world in which international law elaborated over the last century will again be respected by all the major participants. These provisions include, but of course are not limited to, the ideas that empires are fundamentally illegitimate, that citizenship must take precedence over ethnic identity, and that internationally recognized borders are to be respected by all. There is no question that it is absolutely necessary that these and the other values of international law be restored as operating principles. But there is a very real question as to how such a restoration can happen unless there is a fundamental transformation of the institutions of international order, to the point that the new ones will be able to do what the existing ones have not been able to do, and that those who violated them will have that fact recorded as the new ones are elaborated. As in the past, there is today great reluctance to acknowledge the weaknesses of existing international organizations in the face of new challenges. The reason is simple. The very people who will make the decisions about changing or replacing them are deeply embedded in the current ones. Consequently, and for that reason above all, we have seen the self-confident assumption that the existing organizations can do their jobs with only a little tinkering and with only a partial redefinition of their roles, an exercise that can best be described as the construction of epicycles as a way of avoiding facing up to what is another Copernican-type revolution in international affairs. 3 times in the last 100 years, the international community has had to scrap old ideas about the international order and been challenged to come up with new ones and new organizations to implement them. Each time, this process has been difficult, much resisted, and inevitably incomplete. World War I demonstrated that the old balance of power in Europe could not be maintained, and the new countries which emerged from the collapse of empires could not be protected without a new international organization, the League of Nations, an organization that is typically forgotten because of its failures, rather than celebrated for the extent to which it marked a major step forward in the way of doing the world's business. Then World War II, which showed the limits of the League, spawned a variety of institutions, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, and so on. All of these were based on the centrality of the state as the primary actor in international affairs. And for more than 40 years, they performed remarkably well. Even more than the League and its related bodies, these institutions deserve to be celebrated for their contribution to the creation of the current world, the world that has now been violated by Vladimir Putin and his aggression. But the world has done far less well so far in responding to the third challenge, the collapse of the Soviet order and the emergence of failed states, sub-state actors, and subversion by one state of its neighbors as what have becoming the key features of the international system. Despite being given clear warnings about this, including, but again not limited to, Putin's speech in Munich some years ago, his invasion of Georgia and now Ukraine, the reemergence of piracy on the high seas, and the rise of Islamist movements. Few in the West have wanted to think that there was any need for discussion of a complete revision of the institutional arrangements under which the international system works. Indeed, many commentators and even more governments have tended to see such discussions as a threat to the existing institutions or any move forward, rather than as the requisite for precisely that kind of progress. But there is no better place to begin such discussions than in Tallinn, the capital of a country whose fate has been so intimately connected with the successes and failures of the international system in the past, and which is now on the front lines of Putin's plans to trample on international law. And there is no more appropriate venue than at this Lennart Meri conference, not just because of the many outstanding thinkers and activists it has again attracted, but even more because of the man for whom it is named. I am very proud to have received the epithet Lennart Meri's friend from various people in Estonia and elsewhere. And for that reason, it is a source of enormous pleasure to me to have the opportunity to share with you some of the ideas that my acquaintance with him have made possible. He talked often on a variety of subjects, and those of us who were privileged to spend time with him have had our entire ways of thinking informed. We should not forget what we learned. We should try to apply it. That would certainly be what he would argue for. The son of Estonia's pre-war deputy foreign minister and ambassador, who was actively involved in League affairs, and a member of a generation that suffered so terribly when the promises of the League proved illusory. An Estonian activist who had to deal with the limitations of the international system during the Cold War, even as he cleverly exploited its opportunities to help restore his nation. And an Estonian leader who played a key role in that restoration and in the reform of his country after 1991. Lennart Meri was far more cognizant than most of the limitations of any particular arrangement at any point in time, and the impossibility of simply restoring the past whenever that might appear to become possible, however attractive some parts of that past may have been. He was, as many here know, given to playing what he called his little games, both practically and intellectually, in order to raise questions about how things might not be restored, but rather transformed, even if those questions challenged the conventional wisdom and the consensus opinion at the time and made people uncomfortable. He was never afraid to do so. And the fact that he wasn't is in its way underscored by the fact that this conference with his name continues to this day and continues to attract so many to such discussions. Like so many others here, I was Lennart Meri's friend, and also like them, I know how much I learned and continue to learn from his example. Thus today, in the hopes of provoking the kind of thinking I know he would want us to have, I would like to engage in a little game of my own based on his, and argue in ways that I think he would find at least suggestive. 3 reasons why the current international system cannot be restored to the status quo ante after Putin's defeat in Ukraine. However much many might want that to be, and however much many people would argue that goal has to be proclaimed if there is to be any hope of getting there. Second, I would like to look at 3 additional reasons why the current institutions of that system nevertheless need to be strengthened rather than scrapped in the interim. Oftentimes, people who point to what should happen want to dispense with what is in the meantime. Lennart Meri argued against that, and I want to recount some of his arguments. And finally, I would like to talk about 3 institutional changes that should be discussed as we move the world to a post-Russian invasion of Ukraine. When Estonia recovered its de facto independence in 1991, many in Tallinn, far too many in fact, assumed that the simplest and most obvious thing for Estonia to do was to restore the country to the state that it was in 1939, before the totalitarian occupations it suffered over the next 50 years had occurred. Indeed, it was almost a badge of honor among some Estonian nationalists to demand exactly that, to simply restore rather than to cope with the new situation. But there were wiser heads than theirs, fortunately, and among the most prominent was Lennart Meri. He pointed out more than once in the early 90s that you can't go back to a world that no longer exists, and that the Estonia that reemerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s was a different place in a different world, and therefore it could not remain exactly the same. Were he here with us today, I am confident he would say that as nice as it might be to go back to the world before the Crimean Anschluss, and as useful as talking about that may be diplomatically, such a return is not possible, because the Anschluss itself shows the dangerous limits of the pre-existing system. Even if Putin were to withdraw from Crimea and eliminate all support for the supposed Russian world there and elsewhere in Ukraine and the other parts of the former Soviet space, that would only put off but not prevent a final reckoning, and it would raise the question of how the international community should make it clear that what he has done and is doing cannot be allowed to stand, and that the international community must develop in such a way that no one else will try this again, just as it tried to articulate such institutions and ideas in 1919 and 1945. Lennart Meri, I believe, would argue that there are 3 broader trends which make the creation of new arrangements in the world absolutely necessary. First, war today, even more than war a decade ago, is about propaganda and subversion rather than about the movement of tanks. Even if there are significant numbers of troops of an individual country or an alliance on the territory of any given country, war by propaganda and subversion is not precluded. It simply takes on a new shape, and those who don't understand that are doomed to lose. During the Second World War, U.S. General George Patton, one of the greatest tank commanders of all time, observed that fixed fortifications are monuments to human self-deception, as any commander who knows what he is doing and has tanks can simply go around them. Thus, as happy as he would have been and as happy as I am to see NATO, as happy as Lennart Meri would have been, and as happy as I am to see NATO troops in Estonia, and I very much hope there will be permanent NATO bases there for as long into the future as we can imagine, Meri would certainly have been aware, as we all should be, that those are not a defense against the most likely kind of threats that if you call it hybrid war, you call it subversion, that Vladimir Putin and others like him are likely to launch. Indeed, if we continue to think of only a military solution to what is a fundamentally broader set of challenges, we will be in great difficulty. Second, and related to the first point, Lennart Meri would have called attention to the rise of sub-state actors as players in the international system, a development that reflects both the ability of such groups to use the new resources available and the inability of states, including the most powerful, to prevent them from doing so. No matter how strong any country may be, it cannot prevent a determined group within its borders from achieving a great deal, positive or negative, especially but not necessarily if it has the support of another state, group of states, or organizations. There is no reason to think that this new vector in international relations is about to go away anytime soon, and there is little reason to be confident that the existing institutions at either the state or international level have the capacity to prevent its manifestation, however much any one of them, or even all of them, might want to do so. And third, and this is something Lennart Meri was constantly talking about throughout the 90s and the early years of this century, the international system and the power relations within it are always shifting, with some powers growing, others declining, and still others at risk because of one or another factor. The paramount power of the United States is no longer what it was, although it truly remains the last superpower when it chooses to mobilize its resources and direct them at any one target, a choice that is less likely to be made as its relative economic power declines, and a choice which drives it in the direction of thinking in terms of military actions because its other options are less, or at least thought to be less, than they were. The North Atlantic world, too, is also the most powerful economic, military, and political bloc that the world has ever known. But its ability to act is profoundly limited, as Lennart Meri often talked about, by its internal divisions and by national politics that others can play up to in order to divide the United States and the EU, and even more to divide the EU between the old Europe and the new Europe, the two chief vectors of Vladimir Putin's policy. I've written many times that Crimea is not just about Crimea. Crimea is about dividing Europe and the United States, and it is also about the South China Sea because of the messages it sends. And more than most world leaders, I would argue, Lennart Meri was sensitive to the rise of non-European actors, and especially dying. As he lay dying in, as he liked to point out, at one stage, Ward 6, he talked more about his visit to China than about any of his other travels, and more about his meetings with people from outside of Europe than about those with anyone within, except, of course, for Pope John Paul II. Many people confronted by this array of challenges to the existing system would conclude, and some have, that the existing system must simply be scrapped and everyone must start over from scratch. Lennart Meri, I'm happy to report, was totally immune to such thoughts. Unlike others, he understood that one should not tear down anything until there is something available to take its place, even if that means cooperating with individuals, groups, and institutions that represent a large part of the problem. He often talked to me about the fact that there were people in the Estonian foreign ministry when he was its head, whom he would have liked to have seen removed because of their unfortunate associations in the past. But he said doing so would create more problems than benefits, at least in the short term, because whatever else they were doing, they at least knew how to do their nominal jobs. Consequently, I am confident that were Lennart Meri among us today, he would be calling for a strengthening of NATO, both to deter direct Russian aggression in Europe and to cement the US-EU alliance. Indeed, that is the primary function of NATO now, making full use of United Nations network of agencies to develop the foundations for their ultimate replacement, and helping states of all kinds to gain the resources needed to combat the greatest threats from non-state actors, be they propagandists supported from abroad, pirates, or something else entirely, including terrorists. NATO, even more than the European Union, was the cornerstone of Lennart Meri's vision of the world, and getting Estonia into its ranks was his most passionate goal. He was generally too diplomatic to stress, as some wits have long put it, that NATO has three purposes: to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the bigger powers in Europe under control. But he was only generally so, and he recognized, sometimes with a smile and sometimes with regret, that each of these goals remained absolutely necessary as objects of pursuit, even if one wouldn't want to say that. Unfortunately, as Mr. Putin is showing even as we speak, keeping the Russians, or at least his Russia, out of Europe is a task that did not end in 1989 or 1991. A Russia that does not accept the borders of its neighbors or their citizenship as fundamental and legitimate cannot be part of Europe, remains a threat, and must be contained as such. Moreover, Lennart Meri was very much aware that the Americans have to be kept linked to Europe, even as many in the United States look elsewhere to the rising powers of Asia and the Pacific Rim. Leonard understood that without American involvement, Europe in anything like its current form would have been impossible and would be impossible. On the one hand, it could not have arisen during the Cold War if the countries involved had had to think first and foremost about their own defenses. And on the other, it could not have evolved then or survived now if the smaller countries on the continent could not look to the United States to help shape and even contain the older aspirations of some of its larger members. If Lennart Meri was committed to NATO and then to the EU, he was also committed to the United Nations, even as he recognized its limitations. Most of this in this room have seen the famous picture of world leaders at the UN, where Lennart Meri arranged to be featured twice at each end of a common picture of them all. He did so by running from one end of the group when the first part of the picture was snapped, and to the other when the second was, before they were put together. He liked to say that showed just how big Estonia really was, and how a small government, the leadership of a small country, could play a unique role in advancing its interests and the interests of the world by being clever and by playing his little games. What in fact it showed was his commitment to using the United Nations and its various agencies to the fullest. Lennart Meri did not believe in world government, but he did believe very deeply in international institutions. The UN often fails, but as has been observed, there is nothing else on the horizon to replace it. And the world, in his view, can't afford to dispense with it until something else is ready to be put in its place, and people begin to think about what that might look like. Moreover, and more than most senior officials with whom I have had contact, Lennart Meri focused less on the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council than on the multitude of UN agencies, believing, as he said often, that they were of potentially greater importance to the world than the two branches that get more attention. These smaller forms, he insisted, were where the real work would get done, and they were the places where smaller countries not only could play a larger role, but also could promote the development of international cooperation of a kind that would embed and therefore restrict larger powers. But the most important question Lennart Meri would be asking today is what steps should be taken not to restore the status quo ante, as desirable as that might be. Indeed, he would have dismissed it as a pipe dream. But rather, what needs to be done so that we can create a post-Crimea international order, one that will restore Crimea to its rightful place within Ukraine, but which will also create a situation in which there will be no more Crimeas, and no one in the world will decide that what Putin has done in Crimea is an appropriate roadmap for themselves, be it in the South China Sea or somewhere else. On the basis of my conversations with him over the last 2 decades of his life, I would like to throw out 5 proposals he had begun to elaborate even well before the Crimean crisis. Unlike many leaders, he did not think that 1989 or 1991 was the end of history. He assumed that many of the forces that had driven countries in various directions prior to that time would continue to operate, and that we needed to think about that, but we also needed to think how we would cope with a world that was changing as well. I do not offer these 5 because I think he would have proposed them in exactly these words. As you know, he was a protean figure, constantly evolving and constantly demanding that others evolve as well. But I do so because I think he captures themes that he did raise on numerous occasions, and that were he here today, he would insist that we should be exploring, at least in the near term. The 5 Lennart Meri ideas I'd like to mention are the following. First, I think there's no question he would have called for an expanded rather than a redirected NATO. After 1991, many thought NATO needed a new purpose. In fact, Lennart Meri told anyone who would listen, it may have needed a new purpose, but it must never forget its original one, because the world had changed, but not quite as much as many were deluding themselves in thinking. I believe he would have called for a unilateral offer of NATO membership to Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Lennart Meri understood that you do not qualify for a defense alliance. You become a part of a defense alliance because of the contribution you can make or the threat which is against you, but ultimately against those who are members of it already. Second, I am confident that he would have insisted on a revised UN Security Council, one whose permanent membership did not reflect the world of 1945, but the world of 2015 in a double sense. On the one hand, he would have insisted that the current permanent membership is very much out of date. Some on the list should be dropped and others should be added. And on the other, and I heard this from him more than once, the Security Council should be able to take decisions about the actions of any of its members without the threat of a veto from that member. That won't be easy for anyone to swallow. But after Crimea, it is clearly a necessity if the world isn't going to be divided into countries that can engage in aggression with impunity and those that can't. Moreover, it is absolutely necessary that those who engage in aggression, be they the Central Powers in 1914, the Third Reich in World War II, or Vladimir Putin now, are punished for what they do, rather than pocketing what they can achieve and then being reintegrated by some kind of misguided notion of restoring the status quo ante. Third, I am confident Lennart Meri would be demanding that the international community and all of the institutions in it do far more to recognize that international conflicts have changed from being about military force to being much more often about what is now called soft power. The international community has an interest not only in monitoring such under-the-radar use of force, but also helping countries counter it and coming to their aid when that is necessary. That coming to the aid of countries will require a very much more interventionist approach, because to counter these kinds of under-the-radar threats will require those countries to do things well in advance of their appearance. You cannot use a division, exploit a division in a society if it does not exist, and thinking about how to avoid divisions in society that an outsider can exploit is something people should do far more about. That certainly was one of Lennart's messages throughout the 90s and the early years of the century. The international community needs to promote those kinds of domestic policies. That is far more interventionist in many ways, but it is far more necessary, because by the time there are Donetsk People's Republics anywhere, it is very late in the day to play that game. Fourth, in support of this, Lennart Meri would have urged for the radical expansion in the number of multinational peacekeeping and peacekeeping organizations, from joint military formations to alliances to even larger groupings. Such arrangements, he would have said, would have been the nursery schools, a term he often used, for larger and larger units to deal with greater and greater problems. And fifth, he would have urged that none of us should be shy about exploring new ideas on the basis of these common experiences, trying some out and then discarding them. And in that empirical way forward, finding what will work rather than going from theory to practice, as sometimes is the case with commentators. That is why Lennart Meri would certainly be telling all of us here, and I am pleased to have the chance to serve as his mouthpiece, that we have enormous tasks ahead. Not to restore the status quo ante, not to dispense with everything that we have on the table now, but rather renewing the international system, dispensing with some of its elements and adding others to cope with the challenges that we face. Because if we do not cope with these challenges, we will face even more. And the risks of a wider war are all too real. That is something no one who had had the experiences Lennart Meri had with the Second World War and the succeeding Soviet occupation of his country would wish on anybody. It is not something we should allow to happen, because we have the capacity, if we have the will, to do something about it. But that will is going to require us to think in new ways and to use new techniques as well as rely on old ones if we are to have any hope of having a better and more peaceful world in Europe and more generally. Thank you very much.
By any chance, Paul?
Yes.
Still on?
I'm still on.
Yeah, we can't see you. Can you see? You can see us or not?
No, I can't see you either. I don't know what the problem is.
Okay. No, the problem's me. I'm on my feet. Paul, is Garry Johnson. Just to say thank you very much for that brilliant analysis, the lecture, and the way it was put together is exactly what we needed at this time of the conference and exactly what Leonard would have approved of. If I had my way, it would be on the tables of all the leaders of Europe and the important people in the United States tomorrow morning for their briefing session, and take it home and read it and do it. The question is, will they do it?
We'll take care of that.
Good. I got an answer there. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.
We're sorry you're not here. We want to see you with us in the flesh next year, but you're with us in the spirit this year. Get better, come across. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I can't possibly, in bringing the conference to a close, add anything of major significance to what's been said today and what's been brilliantly summed up by Paul Goble just now. What I can do, perhaps, is add a couple of personal thoughts that have come to me during the conference. Paul mentioned Lennart's game playing. The first time I met him, he played a game with me. He looked at me. He had a look rather like a hungry vulture that's looking for a bit of a carcass somewhere, and he fixed me with it. And he said, you know, I never met a general who can milk a cow. I must have answered reasonably. It was a test of character, I suppose, when he threw it at me. I don't know what I said, but somehow we got by and got on with it. And I tell you that story because for those who don't know me, I am here because I was a general. I was NATO Commander-in-Chief in Northern Europe when all the things were coming apart, and came to Estonia and became involved with the Baltic states and the countries of the former Soviet Union in the security sector thereafter. And I'm standing here today as chairman of the International Advisory Board of the institute which is responsible for this conference, and therefore it's my duty to bring it to a close. I think it's been fascinating. I really do, the things that have been said. And one of those tricks of fate, Francois, you're here. On Saturday night, you talked about earthquakes. On Sunday, central Nepal was blasted by a huge earthquake. Do you have magical powers? Yeah. I mean, it's so apposite. 2,000 dead in the valley and many more in the hills. And they knew it was going to happen because in the late 80s, there was an earthquake in eastern Nepal, not that big. All the houses, old houses built of brick and wood fell down. The few that were built of concrete stayed up. Lesson, build more concrete houses. They haven't done so. Why? No money, other things to do. People like living in old houses. Are they going to relocate Los Angeles, I asked myself, along the Great Rift that runs down through California somewhere? Not a bit. You're right to think about the unthinkables, to look into the crystal ball and say, what if? You're right to say what you can do to track it. You're right to say what you can do in certain circumstances to prevent or nullify it. You can't actually do them all. And even here, would we have thought last year when we went away that we'd have been worried about terms that we used at this conference, millions in the pipeline in Africa? How many more coming out of Ukraine if it goes really bad, and if Syria falls apart? If there is a mass influx of population into Central Europe, Western Europe, which has not been seen since the time that the Moors took southern Spain, or the Mongols threatened to take Austria, how would we react to that? Are they thinking about it? Yes. Can they do anything about it? Not much. So these things are going to happen, and we will just have to cope with them as best we may. But if you bring it back to the theme which is pertinent to this country, this region, and that is, what are we going to do with Russia, about Russia? I look at it more on how are we going to deal with Putin. More and more it comes down in my mind to the fact that this is a singleton issue. There's this man who we don't read correctly. And I say that from some experience. I had one part in my life, I was a member of the Executive Council of the Hong Kong government. So I had daily dealings with the brightest and the best of the Chinese community in Hong Kong in all its ways. Most of them educated in England or in the United Kingdom or Australia. And we found it easy to get on, talk about the same things, make the same conclusions, rationalize it, analyze it. We found it easy. I found it easy for about 95% of the time. And then I realized I was thinking as a Brit, they were on planet Confucius. Now, I think you don't have to get to 95% before you realize that we are on different thought constructs and methods of acting to President Putin. And that brings the unpredictability in it to me. And therefore, we have to look for some certainties that we can hang our coats on if it all goes wrong. And they're not very pleasant. I think we're absolutely right to talk about hybrid warfare, propaganda warfare, whatever you wish to say, the battle of the mind, and the sort of society that Putin appears to be constructing in Russia. I mean, I just wonder, when he was a child and his mother was reading him to sleep, it was not with nursery rhymes, but to Orwell's 1984. Because what he's constructing, or appears to be constructing there, is such another world. Now, does it matter, as we heard from this fascinating last panel, that the people are either inert, or there are a few who will say things, the rest will go along for an easy life? That's what people do most of the time. What matters is what he's going to do. And all the predictions that I can make, looking down the unthinkable, is that he will go on doing what he is doing, because that is what he does. He will continue to tease us. He will continue to probe UK and Norwegian airspace, as they did in Soviet times. He will continue to provoke around the Eastern Baltic and Sweden and this sort of area, not quite to the area that you can slap him down physically, but he will tease us. Setting off today from Moscow is a great convoy of the leather-clad bikers that he likes to ride with. They're riding to celebrate the fall of Berlin, in 1945. That'll tease the Germans, won't it? It won't be very pleasant, but he does like teasing Angela Merkel. This time it's with a biker, not with a dog. These are the games of the mind that we should not dismiss as being meaningless. They are meaningful. That's the way he does it. He will not, I wish Paul was right, he will not let go of eastern Ukraine any more than he will let go of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And certainly he will not let go of the Crimea. And are we going to go for war for it? No, he knows that we won't. Because we didn't stop him in Georgia, we couldn't stop him in the Crimea, and we couldn't and wouldn't have stopped him in Ukraine. So he's testing the limits of how far he can go with each of these things. And I'm often accused of being an old general and looking back into history, but the more and more I look at the history of the interwar years, you see it. You see an army, a military who thought they had been defeated by their politicians, not the enemy, a country which had harsh economic conditions imposed upon it, a country in which came to power a minor security official who was looked down upon by many of the top people, but who clawed his way up, created the propaganda, rearmed his military, and then think Rhineland, Abkhazia, Ossetia. Think Sudetenland, Crimea. Think Ukraine, Austria. Now, it's not an exact parallel, of course it isn't, but you can see the way my mind is working. Now, what is the really serious point I do wish to leave with you is that, as somebody said, I think it was Paul, you can read what he's going to do, like you could read Mein Kampf. He has said certain things that we have brushed off because we think that's now not how people behave in the 21st century. The man wouldn't do it. You don't do that sort of thing. Oh, yes, you do. I am increasingly concerned about the nuclear issue. The business of bringing conflicts to resolution by the use of battlefield tactical missiles, we think is unthinkable. But it is thinkable. 10 years after the end of the Soviet Union, I was at a conference in Sweden with a handful of top people, top generals from the West and from the Soviet Union, to discuss the war plans of each country, each side, should war occur. We in the West said we had no plans for the use of nuclear weapons. We did not. We were not allowed to plan for it. Whether they'd have been used or not in the end, who knows? The Russian party said, oh, we were going to use them from day one. And we had thought they would not. We had thought that they would use overwhelming numbers to drive us into the ground because they had more reserves than we did. Therefore, they wouldn't need to. Not the way they think. They were going to do it from day one, and I believe them. Now, Putin has talked about it. And so he's bringing a new look at the nuclear game. We're talking about the nuclear deterrent in the United Kingdom. Do we renew it or not? Intercontinental ballistic missiles, you probably can't afford to give up the insurance policy that you've got there. But this is a new level. This is tactical nukes. This is the sort of stuff they're turning out and going to turn out in India, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea, who bring the level down so you can argue, well, it's better this than a long drawn-out war, isn't it? I think we need to think about it. And finally, because I don't want to keep you from your lunch and departure anymore, I think at the end of last year, I'd have said the mood was apprehensive. I'd have likened it in my interwar analogy to being something about 1934, 1935. This year, I think my personal mood is foreboding, one of foreboding. I think the clock's moved forward to about 36, 37. He is arming. We are effective and have been disarming in NATO for the last 10, 15 years. The correlation of forces is shifting to a stage whereby the use of brute force, which is something the Soviets and indeed the Russians in the past have always thought was a legitimate and sensible, possible way to go, which we think is rather infradig and unpleasant and nasty and bad. It's dangerous, is all I say. Well, I must leave with a word of thanks. I think thank you to Kadri, where are you, Kadri, for that very moving tribute you paid to Nemtsov yesterday. I thought it was a very moving and emotional thing, and it served, I think, to teach us that at the end of the day, it's all about people. It's their reactions and how the human beings in all this game interact and relate. I thank you for that. It was really, really nicely done. Thank you for the team. It's a very small team over there, Thomas and Irina and Piret out at the back, and a very small team. They work exceedingly hard with them and their helpers. It must be hard work. I know it's hard work, because that chap there's aged a year in 2 days. Thank you very much, team. Thank you in absentia to President Ylvis. He drives it. It's his conference. He's there. What other head of state will be there for the whole of the conference and contribute in that way? And the putting together of it and the program is absolutely spot on, timely and bang on. And to get so many influential, interested people to come to it, he takes the credit for that. Thank you to the speakers, fantastic panels. Thank you to all those who came and didn't get a chance to talk from the stage, but who contributed. And I wish you all an enormously safe journey home, with one final word to leave with you. As of August in this year, the director of the Institute will be currently Ambassador Yuri Luik. He didn't wish it to be announced until the end of the conference, but he's happy now that I do so. So there'll be another cracking good conference when Yuri comes to the Institute. Thank you all. Thank you all.